Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Episode 1, Season 1 of the Dozer Tactical Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Mendoza, and thanks for tuning in. Our special guest for today unfortunately could not make it. I didn't know about this until last minute, so this episode will have to be done solo. For this podcast, we talk about recent news articles, first-hand experiences, preparedness tips, tactics for everyday disasters, survival scenarios, and emergencies. Any articles, gear, and training courses discussed in this episode will be provided with links in the episode description. Also, if you haven't already, please leave us a review and let others know what your thoughts were about this podcast on your favorite podcast provider. We're also open to improving our podcast, so let us know how we can improve as well. For today's episode, we will be discussing active shooter situations. I'll be discussing my active shooter story, along with going over what is an active shooter, what actions can you take, and what can you carry to prepare yourself for when it does happen to you. So sit back, get your imagination going, and enjoy today's episode of the Dozer Tactical Podcast. Today, we're talking about active shooters. As of today, December 19, 2020, active shooters have almost become normalized in today's society. With a plethora of fantasy books, games, and movies taking on the topic of active shooters, there is no doubt that you have already heard of this term or may have already been in an incident. My goal for today is to make sure that you come out alive during a shooter scenario, and that hopefully I can teach you a few things or two during this podcast. Let's face it, folks, nothing is off limits anymore for active shooters. There used to be a sort of unspoken rule about where an act of terror would occur. There was this unofficial etiquette, if you will, about where a shooting would happen. But now, nothing is off the table. Churches, schools, courtrooms, houses, malls, military bases, you name it. With any place being able to become a war zone in an instant, it is critical that you know your options and you pay attention to the warning signs. With that being said, let's get into the thick of it. Let's start off with the basics. What is an active shooter? This may seem like a common sense question, but we must establish a baseline definition to help us with the rest of this episode. An active shooter, according to the FBI, is an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a populated area. That's it. It doesn't have to be a specific weapon, it doesn't have to be a circumstance or even a specific motive. It is simply a hostile or multiple hostile threats who are actively engaging in mass murder. Death and destruction is what the shooter or shooters want. So, now that we've covered the definition of an active shooter, and we've briefly talked about the fact that it can occur literally anywhere in the world, let's talk about an incident that I was personally involved in. It was back in April of 2016, during my technical training for the Tactical Air Control Party career field in Texas at Lackland Air Force Base, Medina Annex. The base I was at held a training pipeline for pararescue men, combat controllers, special reconnaissance, or back then known as Special Operations Weather, Tactical Air Control Party, and Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape career fields. I was young, about 20 years old, and I was a very excited and hopeful airman, under the impression that I would never be involved in any kind of tragedy. Well, simply because I felt invincible. I had never been involved in any kind of serious or traumatic events before, and I really believed that I had great luck and nothing bad would ever happen to me. Reading this story about 4 years later, let me tell you, I could not have been more wrong. One day, my team and I were out training, doing the typical fun exercises like bear crawls up a hill, crab walks up a hill, carrying weight up a hill, all the good stuff. I remember out of nowhere, I heard gunshots going off. It came from the building that was maybe 200 to 300 feet away from me. It shocked me because I had never heard gunshots go off that close to me before, with the exception of being at the gun range with hearing protection. I remember looking at the building and thinking, what just went on? At that moment, I felt like all noise had stopped, and it was just the gunshots and wind passing by. I looked over at my buddies to see their faces. They were just as surprised as I was. Our cadre had screamed at us to come over to them, And at that point, I don't think I've ever ran so fast before in my life. So all of us airmen bunkered down in the storage area, which also was the area where the operators kept their gear. We were told to sit down, shut up, and let them handle business. I remember being a little scared, but thinking to myself, what can I do if they come in here? What can I use as a weapon? Where's the best position to eliminate the threat? These were all instinctive questions that were running through my head as we sat there on the floor, not knowing what was going to happen next. After some time, we were released back outside, and we were instructed to use our cell phones and let our families know that we were safe. As we were on our phones, that was when everyone came in. A helicopter was circling above us with PJs, CCTs, and FBI. They all came in and flooded the area. The threat had been neutralized, but they were now checking for other potential shooters and investigating the scene. Unfortunately, that day, we lost our base commander, Lieutenant Colonel William A. Schroeder. The crazy thing was, our commander had just spoken with us the day before. He was giving us a great motivational speech, telling us about how life will be difficult, but we must always push forward and get through it when it gets rough. It also should be noted that the shooter was a former FBI agent and a current technical sergeant in the Air Force, before killing our commander, then taking his own life. Now, you can Google this story and find hundreds of news articles posted about this event. It was sad, it was unfortunate, and it was unforgettable. But the truth is, it happened. I'm telling this story to you to show you that no one is invincible. It doesn't matter where you are, who you are, or what your background is. I was on a military base, one of the last places that you'd think an active shooter scenario would happen. Yet, it did. So remember this, listeners. Don't think about if an active shooter scenario will happen. You have to think, what am I going to do when an active shooter scenario happens? Because that's the reality that we face every day. Up next, we will go over what you can do and how you can help others during an active shooter situation. We'll be right back after a brief message from our sponsor. Welcome back to the Dozer Tactical Podcast. I had just finished going over my account of the infamous Lackland/Medina Air Force Base shooting. So now let's dive into what you can do when you find yourself in this type of situation. In an active shooter situation, you have three main options. These options are to run, hide, or fight. You must be adaptable and realize that you won't just use one method and that's it. You might have to use all three to survive, or only two of them. But these tactics help serve as a guide. You'll just have to determine what is the best course of action to take at that current moment. First and foremost, make sure that you call 911 before you choose any tactic if you can help it. Don't wait for someone else to do it. If you have people nearby or you're in a group, ensure someone has been tasked to call 911 and ensure that they clearly tell the dispatcher that there is an active shooter, followed by the address, which building you're in, how many people are involved, a description of the shooter if possible, and how long has it been since the shooting started. With that being said, we can now go into one of the three main tactics. The first tactic is going to be to run. Now, this is what is most commonly used, and this is typically the highest rate of survival. Basically, if the immediate area around you is safe, and you can very obviously get away, and you double check that you're not in the shooter's line of sight, then this is the best option for you. Run for your life. Try not to attract attention to yourself, and run from cover to cover, preferably in a zigzag style pattern. Don't run out into the middle of an open parking lot or field. There's a good chance that the shooter will notice you and pick you off with no issues. Instead, make sure that you're using all of your senses to help tell you about nearby dangers. Then run away from the scene, running from cover to cover, again in a zigzag style pattern. This will ensure that if the shooter does see you, you will still have some safety between you and the shooter. Once you escape the scene, don't return and continue to act as if the shooter is still in the area. The next tactic is going to be to hide. Now, this is a skill that you will definitely be used regardless if you choose to run or fight. You want to hide and catch your shooter by surprise if you're going to attack, and you want to hide to avoid being found or shot. So this is easy stuff, I know, guys, but the most important element to hiding is being creative with your environment. For example, if you're in an empty room, but you have just a window and you hear footsteps coming up to the room, hang off the ledge of the window. I know this sounds like some Mission Impossible type of stunt, but I've seen this work. I've seen this work in active shooter training before, and let me tell you, it's it's cool to say the least. Hide in a garbage bag. Try to get up into your building's ventilation ducts. Try to just think outside the box. A shooter looks for easy and obvious targets. They won't go searching every nook and cranny for you because the cops will arrive at any moment and there's multiple people to be killed. Finally, we have fight. Don't fight thinking you'll be a hero and save everyone. There's a good chance you'll die in the process. Fighting should only be used as a last resort if you have a clear opportunity or you've been highly trained. When you have to fight your shooter, you're going to want to catch the shooter by surprise if possible. You'll never win a fight head on with a shooter. You will have to flank, sneak around them, or hide and wait until you get an opportunity. When you do get your chance, you've got to be fast and get the gun away from the shooter as fast as possible. Now be cautious because a shooter can easily have multiple guns on them. If you're going to fight, you must be prepared to kill as fast and as hard as possible, and you must also be willing to die in the process. So just remember that if you do get stuck and it's your only option, get the gun away from you and aim for their vital areas. The eyes, the neck, genitals, head, and chest should all be your primary targets. Use whatever you have at your disposal as a weapon and fight dirty. Fight to survive. I won't get too graphic on here, as this is meant to be heard by anyone, but just understand that there are so many things in your environment that can be used as a weapon. Find what you can and aim to neutralize the threat. Another tip is to attack with a team. If you have a few people who are willing to help, it will definitely increase your odds of living and succeeding. Try to plan a coordinated attack from multiple angles. If you can, that's about as good of a scenario as you can get. Fight to the end. Now that we have covered what to do in an active shooter situation, what can you carry on your person to further aid in this type of situation? Regardless of your training, your skill set, or your job, I always highly recommend to take the Stop the Bleed course, which is a free course put on by the DoD. This course will teach you all the basics and help prepare you that much more. It's free, and you can book a class online easily at www.stopthebleed.org. Taking this quick course combined with carrying a small trauma kit or something as simple as a cat tourniquet or some gauze can save your life or the life of somebody else, as long as you have the proper training. I myself currently carry the Live the Creed EDC trauma kit everywhere I go. It's a small, compact kit. It's got all the essentials to save someone's life in an active shooter scenario or for other trauma. Aside from a medical kit, I always recommend to carry a knife. Now, I recommend to view your state or your local laws to make sure that what you're carrying is legal, but once you've taken care of the legal issues, a knife is an absolutely amazing tool to have on you at all times. It can be used for so many things, but in the case of an active shooter, you now have a weapon at your disposal. I say this because all state laws are different, and some of our listeners may not be allowed to carry firearms on them or might have a difficult time getting the legal documentation to carry them in their state. So always carry medical supplies and a knife on you. And if you're one of the lucky ones to be able to carry a firearm on you, then do that. That's the better option here. But we'll discuss firearms in another episode. That's all the time we have for today, folks. Thanks for joining me for the first episode of the Dozer Tactical Podcast. I hope this episode was entertaining for you, and I hope you learned some valuable knowledge today. Also, please remember to leave us a review and give us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. I'm Dan Mendoza, and thank you for listening. Tune in next week for more tactical stories and advice. Stay safe and stay prepared, my friends.